The check sat on the table for 11 minutes before anyone touched it. Table 9. 4 men in pressed khakis, the kind of khakis that had never seen a wrinkle they didn't iron out themselves, laughing too loud for a Tuesday afternoon. Empty plates pushed to the center, coffee cups drained twice, and a check for $83 folded neatly beside the ketchup bottle. Mara Doyle stood by the register and watched them stand up. She watched them shrug into their jackets, watched one of them check his phone, watched another one leave a mint on the table like it was a joke, only he understood. And she watched all 4 of them walk past the tip jar without so much as a glance, laughing about a fishing trip, about somebody's ex-wife, about nothing that mattered at all. She didn't say anything. She never said anything. She cleared the table the way she cleared every table. Quietly, quickly, hands that didn't shake even when her stomach did the math. It always did. $83 in food. $0 left behind. Rent was due in 6 days, and she was $11 short of a full tank of gas. She was reaching for the last plate when she felt it, a weight against her ankle. Warm, solid, patient. She looked down. A German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, a faded service vest strapped across his chest, had risen from beneath a nearby booth, the one where a quiet man in a battered ball cap had been sitting through the whole lunch rush without a word, and crossed the dining room in a straight line, and sat down at her feet like he had done it every day of his life. The whole diner went quiet. And near that booth, the man in the ball cap stood halfway to his feet, one hand braced on the table, staring at the scene like he'd seen a ghost. Before we begin, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city in the comments below, and if you've got a minute, hit subscribe. This one's for the people who carry the heaviest things without ever asking anyone to notice. The waitresses, the widows. The quiet ones nobody tips. Now, let's go back to how Mara got to table 9. 3 years earlier, Mara Doyle had a different last name and a different life. She had a house with a porch swing that needed oiling, a husband who oiled it anyway because he liked the sound it made, and a folded flag she had not yet had to accept from a stranger's white-gloved hands. Now she had a studio apartment above a laundromat, a rusted Honda with a check engine light she'd learned to ignore, and a job at Ruth Ann's Diner on Route 9, where the regulars called her own, and the tourists rarely called her anything at all. She worked the lunch shift and the dinner shift 6 days a week, because 5 days didn't cover the light bill and the storage unit where she kept the things she couldn't bear to sell, and couldn't afford to keep anywhere better. She wore her hair back in a low ponytail. She wore flat, black shoes with soles worn thin at the heel. She smiled at every table, even the ones like table 9, because Ruth Ann had told her once, not unkindly, that a waitress who looked tired got tipped less than a waitress who looked fine. So Mara looked fine. Every day. That was the job, as much as the coffee refills and the pie slices. What none of them knew, not Ruth Ann, not the regulars, not the tourists who barely looked at her twice, was that 6 years before she ever tied on an apron, Mara Doyle had knelt in a dirt courtyard outside a checkpoint in Farah province with her hands inside another soldier's chest, counting seconds out loud so she wouldn't lose her place, so she wouldn't lose him. She had been a combat medic. Sergeant Doyle, 2 deployments. A commendation she kept folded in a shoebox because looking at it too often made the shoebox feel like too much. She didn't talk about it. Not because she was ashamed, because talking about it meant remembering the parts that didn't come home whole, and because somewhere along the way, after the funeral, after the folded flag, after the apartment above the laundromat, she had decided that the smallest possible life was the only one she could carry without dropping something. She had built herself down to a size she could manage. A shift. A shift. A shift. That was the whole plan. But before that shift ended, the secret she had buried under 3 years of quiet would rise up from under a diner booth on 4 paws and walk straight toward her. It started small, the way these things always do. A man came in around 2 p.m. most Tuesdays, always alone, always with a dog that never left his side. The dog wore a service vest, faded at the edges, a small brass tag on the collar that caught the light when he moved his head. The man ordered the same thing every time. Black coffee, dry wheat toast, Eggs over easy, he never quite finished. And he never said much beyond, "Thank you, and keep the change," even though the change was rarely more than a few coins. Mara noticed him the way she noticed everyone, at the edge of her attention, filed under regular, quiet, tips light, but on time. She didn't know his name. She knew the dog's tag said RUCK in small stamped letters, and that was about all she let herself know. What she didn't know, what nobody in that diner knew, was that RUCK had been trained to detect something in people that most humans walked right past. Not scent, not exactly. Presence. The particular stillness of someone who has been through something, carried in a way that dogs like RUCK were built, quite literally, to recognize. The first anomaly was small enough that Mara almost missed it. It was a Thursday, and she'd set down a coffee refill at the man's table, and RUCK had lifted his head off his paws and looked at her. Not at the coffee, not at the man, at her, for 3 full seconds before lowering his head again. She'd felt it like a hand on the back of her neck. She told herself it was nothing. The second anomaly came 2 weeks later. A group of veterans came in for lunch, 6 of them, loud with the particular joy of men who hadn't seen each other in years, and RUCK, who had been lying quietly under his owner's table, stood up without being told, walked across the diner, and sat beside Mara while she rang up a ticket at the register. Sat. Didn't beg. Didn't sniff for food. Just sat, pressed lightly against her leg, and stayed there until she moved. The third anomaly she couldn't ignore. It was the day she dropped a full tray of dishes in the kitchen. An accident, a slick spot on the floor, nothing more. And from the dining room, through a closed door, RUCK began to whine. Not bark. Whine, low and urgent, the exact sound, she realized with a chill she didn't examine too closely, that a working dog makes when it thinks someone is in danger. She started watching him the way you watch weather rolling in. Something was building. She just didn't know what, and some old, quiet part of her, a part she'd tried very hard to put to sleep, recognized the shape of it before her mind caught up. There was a fourth thing, too, smaller than the others, that she never mentioned to anyone. Some nights, closing up alone, wiping down the counter under the buzzing overhead light, she would catch herself glancing toward the window like she expected someone to be standing there, a habit left over from another life, from another kind of watching. She wondered sometimes if the dog could smell that in her, if that was the thing he kept circling back to. If you believe that the ones who've been through the hardest things are often the ones who show it the least, write "never judge" in the comments below. I read every one of them, and I want to know you're out there tonight. Now, back to Mara, and to the man who was about to prove his dog already knew exactly who she was. The man's name was Grant Ferris. Staff Sergeant, retired, medically discharged after an IED outside a checkpoint near Delaram in 2019, took most of the hearing in his left ear, and something quieter than hearing that he'd never fully gotten back. RUCK had been assigned to him 2 years into his recovery. Not a bomb dog anymore, but a psychiatric service dog, trained to interrupt panic before it swallowed him whole. Grant didn't know Mara's history. He'd never asked her name beyond what was stitched on her apron. But he'd started noticing that RUCK behaved differently around her than around anyone else in that diner, and Grant Ferris was the kind of man who paid attention to what his dog paid attention to, because his dog had saved his life more than once by noticing things first. It was a Tuesday. The same Tuesday the story opened on, when it finally came to a head. Grant had come in around his usual time and taken his usual booth near the window, RUCK settling beneath the table, the way he always did, chin on his paws, eyes tracking the room. The slow, methodical way dogs like him are trained to. A few tables over, a group of 4 men from a nearby VFW post, in town on their way through for a fishing trip, had claimed table 9, loud with the easy comfort of old friends. Grant watched, the way he watched most things now, quietly, from a slight distance, cataloging. He watched Mara take the order without complaint, even when the loudest of the 4, a broad-shouldered man named Vernon Hale, corrected her twice about how he wanted his steak, even when one of the other men made a comment about diner girls that wasn't quite an insult and wasn't quite not one. He watched her refill coffee 4 times without being asked. He watched her absorb every small careless thing those men did to her, the way water absorbs a stone dropped into it, a ripple, and then stillness again, like it cost her nothing. It cost her something. Grant could see that, even if the men at table 9 couldn't. And then he watched them leave without a tip. $83 in food. Not a dollar left behind. One of them dropped a breath mint on the table like a small, thoughtless cruelty, and none of them looked back on their way out. RUCK, who had been lying quietly under Grant's table the entire meal, lifted his head, then rose to his feet. Grant reached for the leash out of habit, but RUCK was already moving, 3 steps into the dining room, crossing the diner with the calm, deliberate certainty of a dog who has made a decision and does not intend to be talked out of it. He crossed past 2 empty booths, past a startled busboy, and sat down at Mara's feet just as she reached for the last dirty plate at table 9. The whole diner went quiet, the way rooms do when something happens that nobody quite has words for yet. Mara looked down at the dog. Then, slowly, she crouched. An old instinct, the kind that lives in the body long after the mind has tried to forget it, and reached out her hand, not toward RUCK's, but flat and low, palm up, the exact way you offer a hand to a working dog who might still be wearing a job he hasn't been told is finished. RUCK pressed his nose into her palm and did not move. Grant Ferris stood halfway out of his booth, one hand braced on the table, and stared. Because RUCK did not do that. Not for strangers. Not for anyone but him. Not in 2 years. Not once. "Ruck," Grant said quietly. "Down." A command the dog had known since puppyhood, obeyed without fail. RUCK did not move. Vernon Hale had made it as far as the door when he turned back, drawn by the sudden hush in the room, and saw the dog sitting at the waitress's feet like a soldier at attention. He laughed, the way men like Vernon laugh when they don't understand a room and want everyone to know they're not bothered by it. "What's this?" Dog decided to tip her instead, he said, and a couple of the other men chuckled, and it might have died there, a small, ugly joke swallowed by a bigger moment, except Vernon wasn't quite done. He looked at Mara, really looked at her, for maybe the first time in the 11 minutes he'd occupied her section, and something proprietary and irritated moved across his face. "You do something to get that dog all worked up?" he asked, not gently. "Because that's a working animal, sweetheart, not a pet you can go feeding under the table." The room's quiet sharpened into something else. Mara straightened up slowly. RUCK stood with her, shoulder brushing her leg, and did not sit back down. "I didn't do anything," Mara said. Her voice was even. It was always even. 3 years of practice had made it even. "I don't know your dog." "Well, he sure seems to know you," Vernon said, and there was an edge under the joke now, something that wanted an explanation and didn't like not having one. "That's a psychiatric service animal. Cost the government 30-40 grand to train one of those. They don't just walk up to waitresses for no reason." Vernon, one of the other men, quieter, tried to pull him toward the door, but Vernon wasn't finished. He looked at Grant, who was still standing beside the booth, jaw tight, watching. "This your dog?" "He is," Grant said. "Well, what's he doing?" Grant looked down at RUCK, at the dog pressed against a stranger's leg like he'd found something he'd been looking for a long time, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't have an answer. "I don't know," Grant said. "He's never done this before." Vernon turned back to Mara, and whatever softness the moment might have earned drained out of his voice entirely. "Then maybe you ought to tell us what's really going on here, because in my experience, dogs like that don't sit for just anybody." The diner was fully silent now. Every fork stopped. Every conversation died. Ruth Ann had come out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, watching with the rest of them. And Mara Doyle, who had spent 3 years making herself small enough to survive, felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in a long, long time. Not fear and not embarrassment, but the old, cold clarity that used to arrive right before she had to do something that mattered. "He's not confused," she said quietly. "He knows exactly what he's doing." "And how would you know that?" Vernon asked. Mara looked down at RUCK. At the faded vest. At the small brass tag. At the dog who had crossed a room full of strangers to find the one person in it who understood, without being told, precisely what kind of weight he'd been trained to carry. "Because I used to train dogs like him," she said. The words landed in the room like a dropped plate. Grant Ferris went very still. "You what?" Vernon said. "Before this," Mara said, gesturing faintly at the apron, "at the diner, at the whole small life she'd built to hide inside. Before all this, I was a combat medic. 2 tours. I worked alongside canine units both times." She paused, and her hand, without her quite deciding to, dropped to rest on RUCK's head, gentle, certain. "He's not confused, and he's not looking for food. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do. He's found somebody who's carrying something." The room did not move. "You're a medic?" Grant said, and his voice had changed entirely, gone soft and strange, like a man hearing a language he hadn't spoken in years. "Was," Mara said. "Doyle," Grant said slowly, testing the name on his tongue like it meant something. "Your name's Doyle." "That's right." Grant's face had gone the color of old paper. He took one step closer, and RUCK, still pressed against Mara's leg, turned his head to watch his handler approach without any of his usual protective tension, as if he already knew there was nothing here to guard against. "Sergeant Doyle," Grant said. Not a question this time. Farah Province. 2019. Convoy hit an IED outside the checkpoint at Delaram. Mara's hand went still on RUCK's head. "I was there," she said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I was the medic on that convoy. There were 2 of us pulled out of that truck," Grant said, and his hands had started to shake just slightly, the way old injuries sometimes announce themselves. "One of them didn't make it. The other one." He stopped, swallowed. "The other one had a medic kneeling over him for 11 minutes on that road, counting out loud so she wouldn't lose her place. That's what they told me after. That's what saved my hearing enough to still have some. That's what saved my life. Nobody in the diner breathed." "That was you," Grant said. "Wasn't it?" Mara's eyes had filled, and for the first time in 3 years, in front of strangers, in the middle of a Tuesday lunch shift, she let them. "I didn't know your name," she said. "They medevaced you out before I ever got it. I've thought about that convoy every day for 6 years, and I never knew if you made it." "I made it," Grant said, and his voice broke on the second word. "Because of you." Vernon Hale had gone very quiet, the mint joke and the accusation both long since evaporated out of him. He stood by the door with his hand still on the handle, looking at the waitress he'd walked past without a second glance 11 minutes earlier, and something in his face had started, slowly, to rearrange itself. "You're a combat medic," he said, and it wasn't a challenge this time. It was closer to an apology that hadn't found its words yet. "I was," Mara said again, softer now. Grant reached out and, with a kind of care that belonged to a much older friendship than the one they'd technically just discovered, took her hand. Not a handshake, just holding it, the way you hold on to something you'd thought was lost. "RUCK's been sitting under my table for 2 years, he said, looking down at the dog. "Never once done anything like this. Never once left my side in a room full of strangers." He shook his head slowly. "I think he's known longer than either of us." RUCK, for his part, simply leaned his weight a little further into Mara's leg, tags jingling softly, and looked up at both of them with the calm, patient satisfaction of a dog who had finally finished a job he didn't know he'd been assigned. Ruth Ann, still standing by the kitchen door with a dish towel forgotten in her hands, was the first one to move. She crossed the diner, put a hand on Mara's shoulder, and said, in a voice thick with something Mara had never heard from her boss before, "Han, why didn't you ever tell me?" Mara wiped her face with the back of her wrist, embarrassed now in a different, gentler way. "It didn't feel like something you tell people over pie." "It's something you tell people over pie," Ruth Ann said, and there was a wet laugh underneath it. "It's something you tell people, period." Vernon Hale walked back across the diner. He didn't say much, Men like Vernon rarely do when the thing they need to say is, "I'm sorry." But he reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and set $200 on the counter next to the register. "That's not a tip," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. That's for whatever you need it for. And I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't know who I was talking to." "You didn't need to know," Mara said quietly. "That's not why people deserve to be treated decently." Vernon nodded slowly, like a man absorbing a fact that was going to sit with him for a long while after he left that diner. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He lingered a moment longer, hat in his hands now instead of on his head, and looked at the small brass tag on RUCK's collar like it had answers he wasn't sure he deserved. 11 minutes, he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's not something you forget how to do, is it?" Kneeling there, counting. "No," Mara said. "You don't forget it." What none of them knew that afternoon, not Grant, not Ruth Ann, not the men from Table 9 who left in a different, quieter mood than they'd arrived in, was that this was only the beginning of something. Word traveled the way it does in small towns, and small towns with VFW posts and Tuesday lunch crowds travel faster than most. By the following week, 3 more veterans had come by Ruth Ann's, not for the food particularly, but to meet the woman Grant Ferris had started telling people about. The medic who'd worked 11 minutes on a dirt road outside Delaram and never once let go. Grant came back every Tuesday after that, same table, same order. But he stayed longer now, and sometimes RUCK sat beside Mara's station for a while before curling back up under Grant's booth, as if checking in on an old patient. Some afternoons Grant would talk, slowly in pieces, about the parts of that day he did remember. The heat, the ringing in his ears that never fully went away. A voice counting numbers out loud somewhere above him that he'd later understand was the only thing keeping him tethered to being alive. He didn't remember her face. He'd never seen it, not really, not through the dust and the blood and the shock. But he remembered the voice, and some nights, he told her, he still heard it in his sleep, counting. Mara didn't have easy things to say back to that. Mostly she just sat with him while he said it, the way she'd once sat with him on a road in Farah Province, present and steady and not going anywhere. 6 weeks later, the local VFW post held a small dinner, nothing extravagant, folding chairs and a borrowed sound system in the community hall behind the post office, and they asked Mara if she would let them say a few words about her service. She almost said no. She had spent 3 years building a life specifically designed to avoid rooms like that one. But Grant asked her himself, quietly, over coffee on a slow Tuesday afternoon, and he said something that stayed with her long after. "You don't have to be the whole story tonight. Just let people say thank you. That's all it is." So she went. They didn't make a speech out of her. They didn't need to. Somebody from the post had tracked down the commendation she'd never framed, the one still folded flat in a shoebox in her closet, and they'd had it properly mounted. A small thing, a modest thing, a wooden frame with a brass plate underneath it, and Vernon Hale, of all people, was the one who carried it up and set it in her hands. $83, he said quietly, just to her, before the room's applause started. "That's what I walked out on. I think about that every day now." "You came back," Mara said. "That's what matters." Grant sat near the front that night, RUCK lying quietly at his feet, and when Mara's name was read aloud, her full name, her rank, the years, the deployments, RUCK's ears lifted, and he watched her the entire time with the same steady attention he'd given her that first Tuesday, as if he understood, in whatever way dogs understand these things, exactly what the room was finally getting right. Ruth Ann started keeping a little card on Table 9, hand-lettered, that nobody ever asked her to explain. Reserved. Some tables just are. RUCK still came in every week, still lay under Grant's booth through the meal. But every so often, usually near the end of the lunch rush, he would get up, cross the diner without being asked, and sit for a few minutes beside Mara at the register. Not urgent anymore, not searching. Just checking. Just staying close to someone he'd recognized as one of his own kind of soldier, the kind that keeps working long after the uniform comes off. Mara framed the commendation herself, eventually, and hung it in her apartment above the laundromat, in a spot where the afternoon light caught it without being asked to. She still worked 6 days a week. She still wore her hair back in a low ponytail, but something in the way she stood had changed, less like a woman trying to take up as little space as possible, and more like someone who had, slowly, remembered she was allowed to take up some. 1 year later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, Mara stood behind the counter at Ruth Ann's, refilling a coffee cup for a table of regulars, when the bell over the door rang and Grant walked in. RUCK at his side, older now, a little grayer around the muzzle, moving a touch slower than he had a year before. On the wall behind the register, in a modest wooden frame, hung the commendation that had sat folded in a shoebox for 6 years. Beside it, a small brass plate that Ruth Ann had made without telling anyone, engraved with 11 words, for the 11 minutes that mattered more than anyone knew. Mara set 2 coffees down, Grant's black, no sugar, and a small bowl of water on the floor for RUCK, and sat with him for a few minutes, the way she did most Tuesdays now, in a diner that had slowly become less of a hiding place and more of something closer to home. Outside, Table 9 sat empty in the afternoon light, waiting, as it always did now, for whoever needed it next. If this story reminded you that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who've carried the most, subscribe and stay a little while longer with us, because every table has a story nobody's told yet and we're not done telling them.